Morning all. I found another interesting positional queen sacrifice game, this time from a former world champion, Vassily Smyslov, who has played against Liberzon in the Erevan championship of 1968. I believe this might be Erevan in Armenia, but I might be mistaken. So Smyslov kicked off with c4, the English opening. We see e5, a kind of reverse Sicilian approach, Nc3 Nc6, both sides now fianchetto. And now white uses a very simple idea of gaining space on the queen side, not concerned about trying to castle quickly. He just plays rook b1. So we have this space gaining plan to dislodge this knight, increase central control. If the knight's dislodged, then also e3 and d4 are going to be possible later. So it's to do with a lot of things really, not just space gain but central control. d6 and now b4 immediately. Black tries to put the brakes a little bit on this, or at least get some a-file compensation, dynamic pressure with this move, a6. Okay, so white plays e3 now, as if a plan is to play for d4 later. f5 from black, which does suffer a bit on this diagonal. It can be a bit weaker than usual with f5, but of course black would like to play maybe later for f4 to cause some structural damage to white's pawn structure. Knight ge2 puts the brakes on f4 and also supports d4. After knight f6 we see, actually for the moment, we see d3. Both sides now castle. Bishop d7, and now a4, continuing the space gain on the queen side. So a very natural looking plan from white. After rook b8 we see b5, and white's gaining a little bit of central control really by kicking this knight away from its influence over d4. It goes to e7, and now bishop a3 is providing a nice diagonal for that bishop, discouraging d5 from black, keeping a kind of lock and key on d5. Black plays bishop e6 as though there is interest potentially in playing d5, but another reason is to be able to exchange off on d5 if white wants to put a knight there. Queen b3, putting more pressure on d5 indirectly. So this is typical English opening strategy with queenside expansion. b6, which weakens c6, but is that significant? White plays now d4, and black doesn't really want to play a move like ed, be losing this possibility of breaking out with f4 and giving white a big knight on d4, attacking the bishop. Instead he plays e4, but this allows a knight coming to d4 anyway. After d5, bishop f7, we're seeing a knight d4. It looks as though black is positionally quite uncomfortable here. Queen d7, and now bishop b2, showing an interest in trying to maybe get rid of this bishop and affect black's king safety as a result. Black is also playing ambitiously on the king side, and he's slightly weakening squares and pawns in the process. He plays g5, f5 slightly loosened, but of course the idea, if he can get it, is maybe maybe stuff like this to play for f4 and going for white's king. Knight ce2 puts a bit of more of a lock on f4. King h8. Okay, and now rook a1, as though there's an infiltration on the queen side coming up with rook a7 to start that off. Knight g6, as though f4 is really on the cards now. But white in this position accepts, volunteers, in fact, structural damage. White plays f4. If the pawn is kept there, it's very nicely stopping black's use of e5. But you might think, well, black takes and this measly pawn on the semi-open e-file. Yes, but this is what happens because look at the dynamics now. There's pressure on f5. White can double to put more pressure on f5. Okay, he's giving up e4 a bit, but it's the dynamic compensation here which interests white. even though he's got some self-inflicted structural damage with that pawn on e3. Knight e7, protecting f5. Then the knight comes to c6. Black dare not take that to give white a huge pawn there. He plays rook be8, and now the other knight comes to d4, putting more pressure on f5, and maybe, you know, taking on f5 is now on the cards. In this position, Black resorts to a tactical combination to solve some of his problems with the f5 pawn. He plays knight f takes d5, sacking a knight for 2 pawns, and maybe looking for a third pawn. After bishop takes d5, okay, a natural move, like just moving the queen away here, might mean that knight takes c6 is going to end up 3 pawns for the knight sacrificed, and also e3 is still vulnerable. So queen c2 was not played. I wonder if you can guess what was played in this position if I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, in this position, remarkably, knight takes f5 was played, offering the queen. But if the queen is taken here, you can see that there might be some issues here tactically with bishop takes g7 check, king g8, and then what would happen? Okay, needs some detailed analysis, but for the moment, on this first pass through the game, let's just accept that there's some tactical complications which might be bishop g7, or there might be in fact something even stronger. So in this position, Black tries to bypass the issues in any case, or creates different issues now. He plays rook takes f5. In fact, because of the importance of this now, let's do a brief check if indeed to do with bishop g7 here. Bishop takes b3, bishop takes g7, knight c takes e7, and in this position bishop takes f8. And okay, this seems to be better for white here. Looks to be quite a lot of trouble for Black. If he took, for example, check, now bishop h3, and you can see it's kind of uncomfortable for Black. And the game continuation, okay, so rook takes f5, bishop takes g7 was played, and the king wanted to sidestep maybe this check here with the queen. So king g8 was played in this position. Let's examine why king takes g7 might not be that good. Check, taking on f5. Now if queen takes, we have e4. And if takes here, you might ask, take, rook e1 is painful for e7. Okay, so this e4 is a good resource here. And if knight takes, well, bishop takes d5, white's better here, filling the piece up. So okay, after bishop takes g7, king g8 was played, and you might think, well, is the queen going to move in this position? Can you guess what white played here if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Okay, white plays rook takes f5. So what is going on here? Black finally now accepts the queen sacrifice. Can't really do much else because d5 is under fire now from this bishop on g2 as well as the queen on d5. So he takes queen, and we see now in this position rook takes g5, and it looks as though black does have some severe difficulties with king safety, in particular his dark squares. And is it enough though for the queen to be sacrificed? Okay, black plays knight g6 trying to shield the king on that g file, bishop h6, and there's a slow plan which has emerged now of h4 h5 to drive and win that knight. If rook takes e3, perhaps rook takes g6 and bishop takes e3 is on in this position. Black's next move was queen e6. Let's just check that to make sure. Rook takes e3. Rook takes this should be good for white, this position. Okay. So after bishop h6, queen e6, we saw this slow plan now of h4, which not only means h5 is on the cards, the king is given a nice spot on h2 here, away from queen e3 check, which was played. Queen takes e3 check. And now, okay, of course in this position now it looks as though rook takes g6 and bishop takes e3 has to be dealt with immediately. Black plays queen c3, attacking the rook. Rook f1 now is played. And we have a familiar kind of padlocked status with a bishop and rook eyeing f8, like we saw in yesterday's positional queen sack video. So this kind of pattern of imprisonment, but there isn't a rook imprisoned on h8, it's just a knight being pinned at the moment, and sensitive diagonals here, by having this constant possibility of getting on this diagonal, and h5, there's multiple threats lurking around here. This rook is kind of tied down though to the back row, because rook f8 would be mate because that knight's pinned. For example, you know, rook e2, rook f8 is mate. So this rook's a bit tied down, but black has a lot of resources here surely to play with the queen. He plays actually bishop c4 in this position, and attacking the rook goes to f2 for the moment. Queen e1, and now both rooks double. Rook gf5, which means actually the knight's been released from the pin. Okay, but it also means that, you know, potential h5 and driving the knight means that rook f8 is a menace. In this position, black plays actually bishop takes b5, trying to lure away the rooks from protecting each other. If, you know, if rook takes, then queen takes. Also hitting c6 is useful. I might think h5 is still possible here. That needs checking. In the game, in this position, the queen was kicked with bishop d2. But let's have a look at h5. Does that actually fail tactically? Bishop takes c6 is possible here, and on bishop takes c6 the knight doesn't move because otherwise rook f8 is mating. But in fact black has rook e2 here, using the fact that the bishop is no longer on g2, so this is actually a pin and disrupting white. So black should be maybe okay here on initial inspection. So okay, in this position a more accurate move was played after bishop takes b5, not h5, but bishop d2, okay, kicking the queen. Another move was mentioned there, I believe, but let's have a look after as well in more detail. Bishop d2, the move might be coming up in this position in any case, which is bishop d5, I believe. It looking very strong to get both bishops occupying these two complementary diagonals. Queen b1, and now we see bishop d5 check, King H8, and now finally both bishops complement each other beautifully on these two diagonals. But there's a slight problem. The knight is now free to help defend. Okay, that's taken off here, simplifying a little bit. But white has a huge position here, and in fact black's fate is sealed with this next move. Rook takes e5. The two bishops are wonderfully breaking through to deliver a mating net on the diagonals. Black actually resigned here. If he takes, we see the checkmate with the two bishops. Anything else, we see a powerful discovered check, for example, or double check with mate. For example, rook d8, rook e8, double check, and mate. It's fairly hopeless here. Let's just check for any amazing resources, which I doubt there's any. It's a mating free, force mating free. So let's have a look at that game again. It was a nice positional start to the game. Smyslov gaining space simply on the queen side. I think I've described this plan in one of my own games as a wet lettuce approach, but here it's very, very far from wet lettuce. It's a very aggressive prelude to going for black's king, keeping a grip on the centre, gaining space on the queen side, and at a key moment accepting some structural damage to dampen black's dynamic kingside play. The key moment for this, well, first knight ce2, putting a break on f4, but also of course it's implying knight c6 and knight d4 later. So anyway, king h8, rook comes to a1, and then we see this move, which maybe some of us might initially reject from the perspective of structural damage and e-file and backward pawn issues, but actually the dynamics now are going into white's favour with f5 vulnerable, and this possibility now, okay, where black was very uncomfortable because of f5, he sacrifices a knight. I think white does stand beautifully here, beautifully poised in this position with a big advantage. So if he does, okay, let's try something else. Knight g4, just to show. Knight takes e7, knight takes f5. It's just a bit nasty. Knight e5. Okay, if black sacks a pawn, this isn't very nice, this sort of position at all. White's really using the dynamics of the f-file, a lot of pressure on the diagonal. So if we go back, so this sack, okay, seemed interesting. Let's have a look now. So knight takes f5 was played, offering the queen initially here. If the queen just had stepped back casually, then would it have been that bad? In fact, it still seems as though it's a good position for white. So bishop takes f3, winning the exchange, not going for a pawn, as I previously intuitively mentioned. If knight takes c6, this is probably horrendous. No, it's not. It's not winning a third pawn. It's just a horrendous position for black. Pardon me. Okay, so the idea is just to win the exchange on f3. That looks much more likely. Or kick the queen first. Maybe it's not much of a difference. Then play for f4. So that maybe is black's counterplay plan. So it would sidestepped in this position with knight takes f5, which Engine doesn't really like in this position. It prefers queen c2, just offering that exchange. So this is another interesting scenario where the queen sack is looked down on by our Engine friends. So knight takes f5, and the Engine recommended move is played as in the game. Rook takes f5, not taking the queen immediately, because as we saw in that variation with bishop g7 earlier, it's not particularly good to take the queen immediately. Let's just run through that again. Taking on g7, knight c takes e7, bishop takes f8, and actually even stronger than rook a8 mentioned before. maybe rook f2, which I think causes havoc. Actually, we mentioned rook a8 check before. This is not a good. Now rook f2, you might think, what is it doing rook f2 or rook f1? I believe actually this move is simply opening up bishop possibilities. These bishop possibilities are opened up. So let's say rook f7, and now check is lethal here. The queen's going to have to counter sack. And if anything else, let's say d5, check. Okay, what is going on there? Bishop h3. And again, it's starting to look dire. Knight d6 double check, winning the queen. It looks absolutely dire, this position. After bishop h3, whereas the queen's kind of being won by force here with these double check possibilities. If king g6, that looks fairly desperate. Then rook g8 check, and it's looking like a nightmare. If king h5 here, g4 is mate. So yeah, this is a horrendous position. It seems that the simple move here, curiously, rook f2, is very, very powerful. Much more powerful than immediate rook a8 check. So what did actually rook a8 check provide here? After bishop h3, why is that so different, you might ask, in this position? Intriguing. Even though white can win the queen, alright, it's still better for white, but why wasn't that possibility in the game? After bishop h3, so rook f2 immediately here, and if king f7, this is why now. Sorry, it is to do with this bishop being released. Bishop c6 in this position against king f7. That's really nasty. So if queen e6, knight d4 wins the queen. If queen d8, we can take on e7 here, play rook a8, winning the queen. So the queen's quite claustrophobic here after rook f2 with these other possibilities with the bishop. Okay, for those technically interested in that, I hope that was interesting. So in the game, the queen sacrifice wasn't initially accepted. Rook takes f5. So we saw bishop g7, king j, and again it was offered here with rook takes f5 being played. So let's just evaluate this position. After bishop takes b3, is rook takes g5 actually the strongest move here? It seems, well, the rook's under fire. Okay, and this position is assessed as equal but now growing slightly in advantage. So let's go with knight g6, bishop h6. Again, other moves are preferred, like bishop d4 here. Okay. Queen e6. After h4, it does look as though it's tricky for black to deal with the issues, but the engine is looking at 0 here. Check. And queen c3 recommended. That avoids losing the queen to rook g6, if nothing else. Now in this position, bishop c4 was played. Let's have a look at king h8 to see if this game was actually sound, because that's what the engine is crying out for here. King h8. Is white's concept good here or not in this position? In terms of material, he's got lots of material. 5, 10, 13, 16, 19. Let's give the queen 9, 12. 15, about 20 really. So it's only like a point difference in it technically, but then the pawns, black has an extra pawn as well. But in this position, okay, is black actually in trouble because of his king seemingly a bit unsafe? Rook f2, rook g8, let's follow this. h5, knight takes. Doesn't look entirely convincing, to be honest, right now. If there's no major thing discovered here in these scenarios, I wonder if black did actually go wrong. So let's go back. When he played in this position bishop c4, it's still about equal. Rook f2. Now queen e1, which is mentioned by the engine. Rook gf5, which looks good. And black played here bishop takes b5. So apparently the rook could have been kicked with bishop e6, and then maybe bishop d5. And it's annoying for white. White hasn't got, it seems, a clear winning move here. The move knight e7, for example, doesn't seem on the cards. Black's controlling e7, controlling f8. So maybe a decisive blunder was in this position where black played bishop takes b5 here. Yes, we see a big evaluation shift after this. Bishop takes b5. In fact, very big now. This might be the decisive blunder. In the game bishop d2, but apparently, well, bishop d5 might be technically better, or they're about the same. It doesn't really matter. They're leading. One might assume they're leading totally onto each other in any case. We see bishop d5, bishop d2, bishop d2, bishop d5. So once both bishops now get onto the diagonals, which was made possible by the blunder move for this diagonal to be made available to the bishop, then that spells big trouble for black. Now it's actually a forced mate in 7. That's how much big trouble that is for black. He's just broken down on this diagonal. So we can see, okay, it was a bit of a speculative maybe queen sack, which made the game quite interesting. But the blunder from black was maybe underestimating these bishops on the two diagonals here against the king. So bishop takes b5, which looks clever initially, especially if you consider this tempting of h5 for bishop c6 and the rook e2 idea, as we saw earlier. But it turns out that the two bishops on the diagonals are very powerful. An interesting game anyway, and this could have been a conclusion with the two bishops mowing down the black king here. Okay, hope you got something from that. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.